Okay, for this problem, it is the square root of 3e plus 1, and then out of the square root plus 1 equals e. It's written like this. 3e plus 1 equals e. And the method you want to use is you want to square both sides. This method really just makes the most sense because you already have a square root involved in this problem. So it really just makes your life a lot easier by getting rid of that square root from the get-go. But before we can do that, we need to get it alone on one side. So our first step really should be subtracting 1. What that'll do is exactly what I said. Just get the square root on one side of the equation. So now you're only dealing with the square root of 3e plus 1 equals e minus 1. So what you need to do to get the square root out is you square both sides, just like this. So what you do to one side, you must do the other. So do it on both sides. By doing that, it gets rid of the square root. So you can now write it 3e plus 1 equals you can write it e minus 1 times e minus 1, because that literally is e minus 1 squared. And if you need a visualization, then just write it out completely. So now what you need to do is solve this thing that you already did. So you should write the first part of the problem, 3e plus 1, and then equals, and then solve what's been factored. Make this into just one thing. By doing that, you're going to have to FOIL it. So by FOIL, I mean take the first, you multiply it by the outer number. You take the first again, multiply it by the inner number. You take this number, multiply it by this number. You take this number, multiply it by this number. So you should get, by doing all that multiplication, you should get 3 plus 1 equals e squared minus 2e plus 1. Just like that. So now what you need to do is get rid of what's on the other side of the equation. So subtract 1. You also need to subtract 3e, so you can set the equation equal to 0. So 3e minus 3e, that gets rid of one side of the equation. Just like that. And we're also going to subtract 1, so 1 minus 1, that gets rid of that side. And now you're dealing with 0 equals e squared minus 5e. And really what you want to do at this point is factor. You're pretty much done in finding the problems you need to do at the end. So what I mean by that is 0 equals e squared minus 5e. What you need to do is find what's similar between e squared and 5e. What's similar between e squared and 5e is the e. So you take out e, and what's inside the parentheses is e minus 5. Written like this. And the reason why it's e minus 5 in the parentheses is because you're just factoring this thing. So e times e will give you e squared, and e times negative 5 will give you negative 5e. So you're doing the right thing if you're factoring it out this way. Finally, what you need to do is look at what you've been given. So 0 equals e. That's already one set that we've solved for. The other set that we need to solve for is what minus 5 equals 0. That's an easy problem. It's just 5. So you take what's in the parentheses, and 5 minus 5 will give you 0, and e already equals 0, so you just write them down. Now what you need to do is break them down into two smaller problems. So if e equals 0 or equals 5, then plug it back into the original equation to check to see if they're right or extraneous. What I mean by extraneous is if you plug in one of these numbers into the equation and it's false, then that makes it an extraneous root. So it's almost like an invalid answer for your problem. So we're going to check to see if what we got is valid. So the first one we're going to do is 0. So 3, or the square root, my bad, of 3 times 0, you're going to plug 0 in for e, plus 1, and then outside of the square root, plus 1 again, equals 0. So now what you're going to do is just solve what's in the square root. So 3 times 0 plus 1 gives you the square root of 1. Just like that, 3 times 0 plus 1, so 0 plus 1, just the square root of 1, as I have written below. And then plus 1 outside of the square root, just bringing it down, equals 0. And then you have to ask yourself a question. Well, what is the square root of 1? And that's just 1. 1 times 1 will give you 1. So 1 plus 1 equals 0. That's the way you need to write it. And obviously 1 plus 1 does not actually equal 0. So you can just write 2 does not equal 0. And that would make this value invalid because 2 does not equal 0. So the equation would be false. So let's solve for the other part. Square root of 3 times 5 plus 1 outside of the square root plus 1 equals 0. Written this way. Times 5 plus 1 outside the square root plus 1 equals 0. So what you need to do first is what's inside the square root. So you have the square root of 15 plus 1, 5 times 3. 15 plus 1 will give you the square root of 16. And then outside of the square root, plus 1 equals 0. Not 0, excuse me. Apologize for the mistake. They're equal to 5 because we're solving for the second part of the problem. So they're both equal to 5. So now what you need to do is subtract 1 from both sides. And that will give you the square root of 16 equals 4. Here, the square root of 16 equals 4. And that works because the square root of 16 is 4. 4 does equal 4 all the time. So this works.